We educate people for various reasons. One of them is economic. We hope people, when they become educated, will get a job, don't we? I think most parents think that. They hope their children will become financially independent, don't we? Do you? I do. I can't tell you how much I want my children to be financially independent. The problem is this, that our current systems of education were never designed or intended to cultivate the great array of individual talent. On the contrary, they were conceived with a very particular view of intelligence in mind, a cultural conception of intelligence, and a very particular sense of economic purpose in mind. In short, they were designed, conceived, and implemented from the middle of the 18th century onwards in most countries to meet the needs of industrialism, which needed a very small educated class, and to produce a very large working class of people who would be selling their physical labor, not their intellectual labor. And that's not a theory, that's evident in the structure of education systems everywhere. The trouble is, the whole world is shifting into a completely different mode now, and so that model doesn't work. In fact, if anything, it's catastrophically ill-equipped for the world that we live just now. And my concern latterly has been that we're spending an awful lot of time talking about how to improve education, but there's very little point improving something that's basically inadequate. You have to rethink the principles on which we're doing this work so that we come up with something that's rather better and different. I came across this image recently. I just want to explain what I think. I want to tell you what I think the problem is and then what I think the answer is. I came across this recently. Has anybody seen this image before? I'll tell you what it is. This was a picture that was taken in the Indian state of Bihar. This is an image which shocked the people of Bihar, including the political class as well. The point is that this image was taken outside that building. That building is the venue for an important end of program examination for high school students, and the results will determine whether they go on to the next phase of education. So they're in there doing a standardized test. The people clinging to the building are their parents, who are handing cheat sheets in through the window to make sure they have the best opportunity to pass the test. What you can't see are the people on the ground, the other parents, who are milling around waiting for their chance to get onto the wall. I'm not being openly critical of that because that's the game they're in. But it's an appalling game to be in, isn't it? You have all these people with brilliant capacities and it's all being turned on a particular test. Now, the reason I don't think we should get too smug about Bihar is we're doing exactly the same thing here, except it's horizontal. Our kids are being pumped through these systems in Europe, in Asia, in many parts of America, and our parents here, and they are figuratively also being driven up the wall. I think this is where we really have to start to rethink the whole story of education. There is at the moment a worldwide movement for education reform. It's called the Global Education Reform Movement. A friend of mine, Pasi Solberg, has referred to this as GERM. And it is contagious, from what you can tell. Around the world, there are political attempts to improve education, and there are three principles on which this reform movement is based, which are actually compounding the problem, I think. The good news is there are alternative ways of thinking about education, which will be a considerable improvement. And the reason, by the way, I was so interested to come here is because I know you all work in higher education for the most part, but you have to see education as a whole system. And part of the problem is we don't. We tend to think there's kindergarten, then there's elementary school, and then there's middle school, then there's high school, and then there's college. Of course, the thing is, we're dealing with the same human beings all the way through the process. And what they become at different stages affects what becomes of them later on. But there is something in the system of education which hinges on the expectation of higher education. The whole system of K-12 education in America is now predicated on the ambition of going to college. That's quite new, you know. And I mean, I was born in 1950. And at that time, in the 50s and 60s, in the US and the UK, fewer than 5% of people went to college. It shifted, with the GI Bill and things of that sort here in America. But it's now the target is like 1 in 3 or 1 in 2. It's become accepted that people, their education isn't complete until they go and do 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years in a university. And I think this is a very corrupting influence on the whole character of education. The idea that you're not educated unless you get a college degree. And I want to come back to this in a little bit, but higher education is strategically very important. It's a flexion point, and more particularly, the entrance qualifications to get into higher education is what's exerting the pressure downwards through the whole system. We can't reform schools, we can't transform early years in school education without rethinking higher education. And by the way, you know this, a lot of people are starting to lose trust in higher education. The more people are leaving with large debts who can't get jobs as a consequence, these problems won't be solved by doubling down on the existing model. It'll only really be solved by rethinking what higher education is about and how best it can offer the sorts of skills and aptitudes that people need. Think of the impact of digital technology in our own life. I mean, a transformative technology does two things. One is it extends our physical reach. It enables us to do things we simply couldn't do. But a really transformative technology like print or the motor car or personal computing, it transforms our mind. It enables us to think things we couldn't think without the technology that were literally inconceivable. And that's what happens with the transformative technology. It changes everything, like the motor car did, like electricity did, like printing did, like radio did, like digital devices are doing. The other thing about technology is it accelerates very quickly and its consequences are unpredictable. When Henry Ford invented the motor car at the same time as Benz and others, they did not anticipate the American freeway network. They didn't anticipate Los Angeles and the 405. No, they did not anticipate OPEC and the tilting of the world economies in favor of the oil-rich countries. They didn't anticipate global warming. How could they? You couldn't possibly have done that. If you go back and look at Steve Jobs' presentation of the iPhone in 2007 in Cupertino, it's on YouTube. Watch it again if you haven't seen it for a while. It's very interesting. He made no mention of the applications of the iPhone which have come to change most people's social lives. I mean social media. There was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. Those things weren't around, anything like the form they are now. But people behave now, particularly young people, as if life is impossible without these devices. I came across this research, I thought this was rather good. They didn't anticipate that, did they? More and more research is showing that. I'm not being a Luddite about this, but more and more families and kids are concerned that their children are becoming socially distraught by the impact of Facebook, social media, FOMO and all those things, online bullying. They're facing emotional and social problems we didn't have, and these are at the root of them. So what do we do about all this? Well, the problem, I think, is this, that our current systems of education were not intended to deal with this kind of challenge. They were designed to do something else. And they're based on three principles which contradict the conditions under which human beings have always flourished and which we need to observe if we're to flourish in future. The first is this, that education is based on the idea of conformity. I don't mean social conformity. I don't mean people behaving nicely. I mean that embedded in the system of education, the selection procedures, the examination procedures, the curriculum, the structure of the curriculum, there is a conception of intelligence which has dominated our view of talent. We have, for a long time now, in the West, conflated a certain type of academic ability with intelligence in general. There's much more to human intelligence than that. In fact, the greater part of human intelligence is richer and goes beyond the rather strict confines of academic work. And yet, you have to be good at academic work to do well at all. Having a degree is always thought to be a much higher accomplishment than having a practical skill of some sort. The truth, I think, is that human intelligence isn't marked by conformity, naturally. It's characterized by diversity. And it happens, therefore, that if you have a system of education that's based on a narrow view of ability, on a conformist view of ability, people who don't fit that mold will think they are the problem and will naturally feel that they are eccentric. And so we end up inventing remedial programs for people who just aren't interested in the main diet that's offered at school. We have a dropout rate, I don't like the term dropout truthfully, but a non-graduation rate in America from high schools that varies, according to state, between 15 and 40% of non-graduation rates. I mean, if you've got an average of 20% of kids not completing high school, you can't blame the kids at this point, can you? This is the system that's at fault. The evidence everywhere is if you refresh your conception of intelligence so it corresponds to how people really manifest it, then all kinds of people who are excluded become included, empowered, and engaged in a way they didn't before. So this has implications for the curriculum, clearly, and for teaching. The second is that the current system is based on compliance, which is what the testing movement is all about, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry. But we were looking at the testing industry. And, I mean, check the figures out. Don't take my word for it. I mean, I was a bit astonished, and we kept checking it and thought, well, that's how it seems to come out. But in 2013, when we were doing these numbers, the NFL, the National Football League, which incidentally is not football, Just saying. Just saying. The NFL was a $9 billion sector in terms of income generated. The US cinema domestic box office was an $11.2 billion industry. The education, testing, and support industry was a $16 billion industry. Can you imagine what we could do to improve universities, colleges, schools, early years education with an extra $16 billion a year? And by the way, this whole testing industry has contributed nothing to the improvement of standards, nothing at all to empower teachers, nothing at all to engage students, nothing to remediate the non-graduation rate, nothing. It hasn't even inched America higher up these international league tables in the subjects that are being targeted, like maths and science. The whole thing's been a calamitous failure. And yet, people, it's an article of faith, they keep going on with it. So compliance is a big deal, and I really think we have to push back against it. But the third element of the system is competition. Like the kids. The whole thing is about competing, schools against each other, league tables. When actually what drives human achievement is collaboration. It's the opposite, it's collaboration. It can be driven that way. There can be a shared goal, but human beings are intensely collaborative. Our systems ought to be celebrating diversity, creativity, and collaboration, and they kind of penalize all three of those. I think we have to, as I say, get back to basics. So for me, one of these starting points, say, well, what's education about? You'll have your own view of this, but there was a philosopher called Walter Bryce Galley who said once that education is an essentially contested concept. And he's clearly right about that. What he means is it's one of those groups of ideas that are essentially troublesome. This is my attempt at saying what I think education is for. By the way, learning to me is a process of acquiring new skills and understanding. There's a difference, isn't it, between learning, education, and school. The problem is not kids, it's not learning. The problem is school. I think the problem is how we've come to do school and the way we've come to think of education. And that's, I think, our historic challenge, to rethink the purpose of education and therefore how we do school. And it's, by the way, one of the reasons why I was also keen to come here, because I think Top Hat and similar companies are helping to revive and revivify how we think about collaboration, that's what this last presentation was about, among teachers who are, in the end, the absolute beating heart of a successful education system, not the testing companies, but the people who actually engage with the students. I'll come back to that in just a minute. The physical and cultural and living world that surrounds us, in which we make our way. So part of the role of education is to help people understand that world as best we can. And that calls for a very broad curriculum, not just in sciences, though definitely sciences, but in the humanities, which is about understanding the nature of human affairs and culture, the arts, which are about the nature of human experience in the world, physical education, mathematics, and so on. You can't engage people in the world around them with a partial and biased conception of the mind, which focuses on certain disciplines to the exclusion of others. Now, the thing is, we have a kind of half-hearted attempt in most cases to help kids understand the world around them. We do very little currently to help them understand the world within them. And it is that world within them in the end, which is who they are and what becomes of them in their lives. And we only really fully understand the world around us by knowing our own passions, our own interests, our own capabilities and possibilities. And it's for that reason we need to have forms of education which are consistent with the nature of human growth and development. Because children go through an immense metamorphosis, do they not? From the moment they're, well, long before they're born, from the moment they draw a breath to adulthood, they change in every way. They change physically, they change cognitively, emotionally, spiritually, they change morally. Education has a vital role in all of these processes, and to conflate the complex process of human development to a series of grades for a college entrance exam seems to me to be the most absurd reduction of the enterprise that you could imagine. But shifting that, is our great aim. So what I argue in Creative Schools, among others, is there are these four big purposes to education. Again, you'll have your own, and I'm not going to go into them in any detail. I just want to show you something of this. Clearly there are economic purposes. That's what we want, I think. So we have to think, well, what sort of skills do people need now for the life they're going to lead? Well, as AI begins to accelerate, we should be focusing on those things which are distinctively human. The powers of curiosity, of creativity, of compassion, of collaboration, of historical understanding, of cultural empathy. These are tied up. The economic purposes are always tied up with cultural purposes. There are, aren't there, at least three conceptions of knowledge that we should be thinking about in education. There is, so to speak, propositional knowledge, which philosophers write largely about, which is knowing that. something is the case. You know, the Second World War started officially in 1939. It ended in 1945. And our curricula are full of those things, not least because they're easily tested or seem to be. But there's also knowing how to do things, how to put ideas into practice. The practical manipulation of technology is the application of tools and understanding in the real world, bringing things about, wroughting things, creating innovation. And our civilizations depend on that. We depend on people who can do things. It's very odd, isn't it, that we've come to venerate academic ability in education, but outside of education, the easiest way to knock down any argument is to say it's purely academic. You know, academics are meant to live in ivory towers, detached from the real world. This is partly, by the way, because the universities colonized the business of education at a very early stage. But knowing how to do things is as important as knowing that something is the case. There's also another category which I think is more neglected, which is knowing this, you know, knowing what it is to be a person, knowing what this experience means, knowing what it is to love somebody, knowing what it is to feel depressed, knowing what it is to experience hardship, knowing what it is to be a refugee. That's what the art's about. It's the lived experience of a human being in the world and expressed in media that make it comprehensible in some way. Our kids are suffering, not just in America, by the way, I mean all around the world, from untold amounts of stress, often depression, hopelessness. Not all bad, you know, but these are historically high figures that we're contending with, and it isn't the kids, you know, it's the system, clearly. It's not only education. It'd be quite wrong to think all these things originate in education. They don't. You know, kids bring issues into the classroom with them. They live a life outside of education. These issues show up at school. They don't all originate, but school often compounds them. It doesn't help to remediate them. It becomes part of the problem, not part of the solution. And part of the solution, I think, is to recognize that education is, above all, a social process and a personal process. That children learn to speak from other people, by the people who surround them. They learn values from the culture they're part of. They don't get born into language, speaking into the world, speaking Polish, you know, or speaking Zulu. They learn this from the people that surround them, like they learn everything from the people around them. It doesn't mean it in some way alters their innate disposition, but it's a social process as much as it is an economic and a cultural one. And it's what's happening, by the way, in the flipped classroom. It's what's happening in the kind of work that you've been discussing the last couple of days. It's recognizing that education isn't a monologue, saving, you know, today. It's a conversation. I mentioned that the Dalai Lama said lots of good things. There was a question that came up at one point in this peace conference that was put to him, and he paused for a long time. Quite long, you know, like a minute. You know, I was getting a bit jumpy, frankly. And we're all leaning forward metaphorically. And then he took a breath and we thought, here we go. This is going to be great. And he took a breath and he said, I don't know. And I thought, what do you mean you don't know? You're the Dalai Lama. You know, you have the definite article right there in your name. And he said, I don't know. I haven't thought of that. What do you think? He said to the room. It illustrated two things to me. One of them is that human knowledge is a fabric. Nobody knows everything. Nobody can know everything. It's a closely woven fabric. We all know bits of something. Not everybody can know everything, and we should never attempt to do that. And the classroom is full of people who have parts of the puzzle, and it interlocks in all kinds of interesting ways. So, and the other thing that struck me is he said, oh, what do you think? And it illustrates that here's one of the world's great teachers is also a constant student. He wants to know. And the great teachers have always been great students. Great students are great teachers. It's what the flipped classroom is about. It's what is meant by the agile classroom. It's one in which there is energy, agility, and vitality, where it's a community of learners being facilitated by an expert teacher, but it's not a passive group of learners listening to a teacher at the front discharging what they happen to know, say, saving today's graces. But properly conceived education is a conversation. It's a dynamic encounter that's guided by expert and knowledgeable mentors, and one that recognizes that students are part of the conversation and not just the recipients of the students' wisdom.